February 22nd at 11:50 p.m. A train set to depart Philadelphia for Baltimore is being held, waiting for the arrival of a special package. Once the package has arrived, the train can then depart and start heading towards Baltimore. But in the back of the sleeping car, two businessmen, a lady and her tall invalid son, are allowed to enter through the locked rear door. Now, that is never open to let passengers in, but on this special occasion, so the invalid son doesn't have to be embarrassed, right? They let them in through the back door. Once the package arrives, the train does take off for Baltimore, where the two men, the lady and her invalid son, will depart, as well as the package, at 3 o'clock a.m. in Baltimore, traverse across the entire town to the other train station, board that train, and proceed to Washington, D.C. It will turn out that their arrival will be one of the most secret and most important in American history. The reason for the secrecy is because of the continued war between good and evil, a war that we face even today. Let me pause and say thank you so much for the opportunity to share with you all over the past 4 weeks. We did 3 weeks. We did a week, took a week off, and then the last 2 weeks. And it has been a treat and a blessing, especially here in the congregation of which we are members. So I didn't have to travel anywhere for this one. It was just wonderful. So we leave tomorrow morning around 7 a.m. for Illinois to do this program. And so, and then we'll be in Kansas after that. And so thank you for the opportunity to get to do it here and be home and see lots of friends and family as well. Tracing back this war between good and evil, for me, Revelation chapter 12 contains one of the saddest events ever recorded. Then another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his heads were 7 diadems. And his tail swept away 1/3 of the stars of heaven, and threw them to the earth. And there was war in heaven. Michael and his angels waging war with the dragon. The dragon and his angels waged war. And they were not strong enough, and there was no longer a place found for them in heaven. And the great dragon was thrown down, the serpent of old, who is called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. There was war where? In heaven. Heaven. Angels versus angels. Michael and the faithful versus Satan and the rebellious. It seems that possibly 1/3 of the angels sided with the rebellion. They were defeated. They were cast out. But what happened? What led to this war, of which I would contend we still get tangled up in to this day? The scriptures give us some clues. We don't get all the details, but we get some clues. For one, we're told Satan here is the serpent of old who deceives the whole world. That's a reference to the events of where? The Garden of Eden in Genesis, exactly. We also have Ezekiel chapter 28, where God is speaking through the prophet judgment against the king of Tyre. And as he does that, he makes some analogies about how evil he is and how bad he has fallen and what's happened in his life. And he makes analogies to the evils of Satan when he does that. And so by doing so, we learn a little bit about Satan. Let's see what it says. You had the seal of perfection, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. You were in Eden, the garden of God. Was the king of Tyre in the Garden of Eden? No. So you see the analogy being made. The king of Tyre is so wicked and has fallen so far, it's just like he was the devil. But you see, we're learning about the devil too. Every precious stone was your covering, the ruby, the topaz, the diamond, the beryl, the onyx, and the jasper, the lapis lazuli, the turquoise, the emerald, and the gold. The workmanship of your settings and sockets was in you. On the day that you were created, they were prepared. You were the anointed cherub who covers, or some translations say guards. And I placed you there. You were on the holy mountain of God. You were blameless in your ways from the day you were created, until unrighteousness, other versions say evil, wickedness, iniquity, was found in you. You were internally filled with violence, and you sinned. Therefore, I have cast you as profane from the mountain of God, and I have destroyed you, O covering cherub. Your heart was lifted up because of your beauty. You corrupted your wisdom by reason of your splendor, and I cast you to the ground. It seems that the devil was tasked by God as the anointed, guarding cherub. He was working in the midst of God, but then he corrupted himself with his wisdom. And that wisdom, it points out here, was he looked at how grand he was, how wonderfully adorned he was, and then possibly the highest ranking of all the heavenly beings, and then compared that self to something else. And when he did that, iniquity, wickedness, evil was birthed in his heart. To what did he compare himself? Possibly the Creator God himself. There's some old, interesting Jewish traditions, though, that Satan, again, this is not in the Scriptures, this is just an old tradition, that taught that Satan was tasked, when he was still there in the realms of heaven, as the guarding cherub to guard humanity. Iniquity was birthed in his heart when God gave Adam and humanity dominion over this creation, over this earth. And it's possible that in the old tradition, Satan saw that and said, well, what about me? Look at how wonderfully adorned I am. I am the greatest, the highest rank in all the heaven. And what do I have dominion over? Nothing. Maybe it was the difference between the created value of humanity versus that of the angelic realm. For when we sin, is there a hope for us? Yes. But what about for the angels? Has there been a price paid for their redemption? No. Whatever the case may be, whatever it was he saw, whatever it was he compared himself to, it incensed him, and it led to a rebellion. Isaiah chapter 14, same thing happening here, this time verses about the king of Babylon. And here we have, how you have fallen from heaven, O star of the morning, son of the dawn. You have been cut down to the earth. But you said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven. I will raise my throne above the stars of God, and I will sit on the mount of assembly in the recesses of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds, and I will make myself like the Most High. And it's possible a third of the angels went with him. Now, why would God let that happen? Have you ever wondered, why make the devil if you know the devil is going to do what the devil is going to do? Why would he create Satan knowing he would rebel? Well, for one, aren't you glad he still made you knowing you would rebel? But in his infinite wisdom, of which we will never fully understand, but in which we can greatly rejoice and take comfort, amen, he, once again, made us, humanity, you and me, with redeemable value. We can be redeemed. Even when we mess up and we rebel against him, he does not simply toss us in the trash, does he? No, instead, we are worth keeping and fixing in his eyes, offering us multiple second chances. Do we deserve them? No. Yet he still does that. He has done literally whatever it takes so he doesn't have to spend a day of eternity without you. Satan, Gabriel, Michael, all the heavenly hosts, they do not have that. They have or had the privilege of being in the actual presence of the majesty in his throne room. They too have a choice. However, there's no plan of redemption for them. So why then did God make Satan, knowing he would choose to rebel? I cannot speak for the wisdom of God, but one thing I've seen in the scriptures is this. Everything in the entire creation, you can see this greatly on day 4 of the creation week. Everything is made to point us to him, to teach us about him, for us to learn more about our Creator and our relationship with him. So is it possible this was allowed to happen so that you and I could have just another little glimpse of better understanding that unlike Satan, we get the multiple second chances. And he has done everything it takes so we can spend eternity with him. The devil knew that, yet still chose to rebel, so don't feel sorry for him. He knew better. We are that precious to our Creator. And he chose this possibly as one of his ways to communicate how valuable we are to him. So why then, you got to wonder, would anyone want to choose an eternity with Satan and his followers in the destruction of hell, instead of with the loving Father in the eternity of heaven? It is such a great salvation. It's so remarkable that Peter says in 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 12, that even the angels long to look into it. They look at this, what we've been offered. They study it. They're amazed of what has been offered to us. And oh, that we would be just as amazed. So this battle has raged on since the beginning of time. Satan utters the lie of Romans 1:25 and Genesis chapter 3, verse 4. Oh, you surely won't die. There's no consequence to what you choose to do. It's okay. And that's the lie upon which all other lies are built upon which all sin is conducted. He then teaches Eve humanism. Oh, you'll be your own God. He teaches her evolutionism. Oh, you'll become so much greater than the level of life form you are now. She eats, Adam standing right where? With her. He eats. Adam always gets the blame in history for sin entering the world. Why? Because whose job was it to provide, protect, and defend his family? Adam's. So a breakdown of the family allows sin to enter the world. Whatever he was thinking, he placed Eve's desires, his desires, whatever, above what God says. That's idolatry. And thus sin entered the world. And, well, that's it. Evil won. It's all over with. All done. Is that how the story ends? No? The hope of Genesis 3:15, there would be one who would be born, the seed of the woman, would crush Satan someday. That's a prophecy of the Messiah to come. That ends up being who? Jesus, exactly. How will we know it's him when he arrives? Apparently there'll be one born who will need no seed from the man. Be just of the woman, the virgin birth. But the war has waged on since then. Jesus came, he fulfilled the prophecies of the Messiah, died, rose again, is alive to this day, but the war has still continued on. Just as there was civil war in heaven, there has been civil war within humanity. Because you realize any time there is war between people, wherever it is, that is a civil war between humanity. Because we are all image bearers. We are all precious in the sight of God, made in his image. So that's the reality we deal with. Everyone. Acts chapter 17, verse 26 makes that very clear. We all came from the same original parents. We all have that incredible innate worth in the eyes of the Creator, and so should be in the eyes of everyone. So that brings us to the issue of how we should treat our fellow man, how we are to conduct ourselves and treat one another. Now, obviously, if you've gone to church and you've listened to the lessons, you would know that Jesus taught we are to love our neighbor as ourselves, Mark 12:31, and that we're to do unto others as we'd have them do unto us, exactly, Luke 6:31. But there's still been civil wars within humanity. Wars are sometimes necessary evils. World War II, in the effort to stop what was happening. In wars, there are victors and there are losers. Historically, the losers would become subservient to the victors. Those that have been conquered in history would often become slaves to the victors. That's just how it worked. It didn't have anything to do with nationality, ethnicity, how you looked. It's just your country was waging war with this one. You got beat, so now you serve that one. Because otherwise, you might someday go find some friends and come back and beat us next time. So that's just how it worked. But this brings up the issue of the enslavement of our fellow human beings. Tonight, I want to look at the historical, the biblical, and the American view of slavery, and what we are to learn from that in this overlying war between good and evil. Now, we just noted historically, if you got beaten in war, you became slaves to the victors. Didn't matter anything else. It's just you got beat. That's how it worked. Done. End of story. There you go. That was point number one. You think this is going to be a short night. You just keep thinking that. All right. Biblically, though, what is the biblical teaching regarding slavery? Everywhere I go, I find out most people in the churches don't know. They've heard what they think is the biblical view. They're not sure because we hear it all the time in the media what the biblical view is. Did anybody actually go look it up? Let's take a look. The Israelites, God's people, find themselves as what? Slaves in the land of Egypt. And they cry out for his mercies in the book of Exodus. They were not enslaved simply because they were Hebrews. They were enslaved because they weren't Egyptians. And the Egyptians feared them taking over, that they would be an enemy to them. Yes, they may have looked a little different, sounded a little different. It didn't matter. It was a political, military issue. So the Hebrew nation, they understand the burdens of slavery. Absolutely. With that context, look at what God wrote in the law given to them at Mount Sinai after they just were delivered from slavery, from Egyptian bondage. Take a look at what the Bible, what God told them was the rules in their law about slavery. Here they are. Exodus chapter 21, verses 2 through 6. Bankruptcy or debtor slavery. One could sell himself to a fellow Hebrew to work off to pay for debts that they had incurred, and they couldn't find any other way to pay them off. So you go work for someone. There's even provisions made for the case if you got married while you were in debtor slavery. And then, after the debt was paid, what would happen? You're freed. Or what happened if 7 years had passed? And a year of Jubilee came. You were freed. This was unheard of in the world at the time. Bankruptcy protection laws. This is the earliest, as far as I know of, recorded in history given to the Hebrews by the Creator God. Chapter 21, verses 7 through 9 is debtor slavery for women. It was different. It's, yes, because, just women were treated as property. And no. Check it out. If a woman was to sell herself, actually sell her debt to someone, it had to be within the bonds of marriage with permission of her father. If the man purchasing her debts, he was purchasing her debts, turns out he's acted deceitfully in any way, it can be annulled right then and there. Done. Over with. Who had the protection? The man or the woman by the law? The woman. She was being protected. He can never sell her because how long is a marriage supposed to be for? For life. He's to remain married to her forever then. Thus, there's no 7-year limit or anything like that. It was all intended to protect the sanctity of marriage within this whole bankruptcy system. That, again, unheard of in the world at that time. Nothing like it. Chapter 21, verse 16 then. Outright slave trade. If anyone goes out and captures someone, whether they're a Hebrew or not, forces him to be a slave or sells him to someone else to be a slave, person found guilty of doing that, death penalty. Done. It's a capital crime. How many knew that was the law in the Old Testament? It was a capital crime to be involved in actual slavery. Verse 20 talks about punishment of cruel masters. Again, find that anywhere else in the world at that time. And chapter 25, verses 44 to 46 of Leviticus. Slavery from conquest. We've already talked about how in history, if you conquered someone, then they became your slaves. In Old Testament law, that was permitted, but there was a little caveat to it. Again, remember, actual outright slave trade, forbidden, death penalty. But if you defeated someone, which this is a nation that's going to be involved with warfare with other countries someday, yes, you're allowed to keep those whom you defeated as slaves, but here was the deal. The way they were treated was to be unlike anywhere else in the world. They treat us with worth, with value, with respect. They treat us so differently. You all act and behave so differently. What is this about you all? Who is this God whom you serve? And you see what the opportunity may be then, that they might convert and become a fellow Hebrew with you. So it's completely different from the rest of the world and how it's to be conducted. And then chapter 25, verses 47 through 55 of Leviticus, redemption slavery. If a fellow Hebrew has sold himself to a foreigner, it is the duty of his fellow Hebrews to try and buy him back, paying the price for redemption of their Hebrew brother. Oh, you talk about something that'll preach right there. And that's slavery in the law. It is not cruel. It is protective, sometimes helpful, and completely different from the rest of the world and how they were to treat their fellow human being, whether they were a Hebrew or not, because they were made in the image of the Creator God. To the point, what's the punishment if you actually involve yourself in the slave trade? Death. In the New Testament, several passages discuss the relations between masters and slaves. What you find there, again, is not the allowance of slavery. Oh, yes, it's a good thing, it's fine, go ahead. No, it was how do you deal with it when you find yourself in that situation. For one occasion, there's a whole book in the New Testament about slavery. What is it? Philemon. Exactly. When Paul tells Philemon, I'm sending Onesimus back to you, he is a runaway slave who's become a Christian and realizes I should go back. Paul tells him, don't receive him back as a slave, but as your brother in Christ now. Those who found themselves as slaves, which was pretty much Everyone in the Roman Empire, the vast majority of people, if you're not a Roman citizen, you're a slave to Rome. Now, did you notice it looks completely different than what we think about slavery? You still lived at your home, you still went about your business, you did lots of freedoms and everything, but you were still a subject of Rome. They occasionally had a little bit of slave trade going on, but for the most part, Rome was not built on the back of slaves, as in it didn't rely upon a major slave population. It was just commerce and economics. Occasionally, yes, there was. But for the most part, that wasn't the deal in Rome. If you were a Christian, you became a master. Or you were a master who became a Christian. You were to be the best master you could possibly be, so that they would see the love of Jesus in you. If you were a slave to someone who was actually a master or lord over you, you were to be the best slave you could possibly be, so you might be a witness to them of the light of Christ. That's what the New Testament says about it. In fact, rather than being a racist, sexist, bigoted religion, as Christianity is made out in our world today, the words of Galatians 3:27 through 28 are monumental in the affairs of mankind. For all of you who have been baptized in Christ, have clothed yourselves as Christ. It doesn't matter if you're Jew or Greek. Doesn't matter your ethnicity. Doesn't matter if you're slave or free. Doesn't matter your status in society. Doesn't matter if you're male or female. Everyone is one in Christ, because we are that precious to our Creator. Find any other literature from that time that's saying that. In fact, 1 Timothy 1:9 through 10 says that slave traders are lawless, rebellious, unholy, worldly, ungodly sinners. That's what the New Testament says about slave trade. So does the Bible condone slavery? Specifically the kind that we've seen in 18th and 19th century America? Absolutely not. So let's talk about slavery in America then. Hey, we're already on point 3. We're doing good, okay? When the first slaves arrived in 1619, this may come to shock for those who have learning American history, but in 1619, there was no United States of America. Just in case you had missed that. So can the United States be blamed for bringing slavery to the Americas? No. Our birthday year is 1776. That's right. So what we find in the 17th and 18th centuries is the establishment of global trade. Trade amongst empires around the whole world. Who remembers the old triangular trade route from their social studies books? Okay, 2 of the younger people. That's about it. Okay, 3 or 4 of you. Very good. Yeah, I know. I used to be a school teacher. It's sad. But anyway, if you never saw the triangular trade route, that's what they'll teach you in social studies class. So, we started this thing of global trade. To be more honest, it was more like this. Not much triangular to it, okay? But you see the pattern, okay? International trade had grown to a global scale and was growing. And so what ends up happening is slavery goes from being something of conquest to something of commerce. And it becomes a commodity that is purchased. Now, it's conquered peoples who are being purchased, but guess where the cheapest market is to buy them? Africa. Where warring tribes are paid, the victors are paid by European powers with weapons and supplies and ammunition and food and whatever else, riches, whatever you want, to go conquer and get more. And then you get more materials, and then you get to go conquer more. In fact, the whole way the continent is divided, you may have had tribes living in peace, but then they got split up into countries where you had warring tribes together. And because of the European powers, now they divide up Africa, that is why its development in the Industrial Revolution and the economic revolutions and political revolutions that have taken place since then has been so far behind everyone else. It's horrific. It's interesting, when you hear about the lessons of slavery, it's rarely mentioned about the trans-Saharan or Indian Ocean slave trade. They just jump to 1619 and forget about how the Ottoman empires and the Barbary coast trade, Thomas Jefferson and the Barbary pirates, shores of Tripoli, all that, okay, the marine hip, all that going on there. There were 1.25 million white Europeans who were captured and enslaved in those areas. And it wasn't until well into the 17th century that black slaves in the New World outnumbered white slaves in the Old World. Who knew that? They didn't. Okay, one history book, they leave that part out when they talk about slavery. But what does happen in the Western Hemisphere is that the look of slavery, particularly in North and South America, takes on a uniform look and color. And who's responsible for this? The Transatlantic Slave Trade Database is a phenomenal resource. And what it shows us is British, French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Dutch empires or trade businesses were responsible for the organizing and operation of the transatlantic slave trade. Here we see 12.5 million Africans, some estimates up to 15 million, taken from their homes through the 16th and 19th centuries. A quarter of them will die en route because of how terrible the conditions were on the ships. Of that, around 387,000 are brought to what becomes known as the British colonial America. So about 2.6 to 3.1%, given the 12.5 to 15 million people. Let me say it this way. Of roughly all of the 12.5 to 15 million Africans taken out of their homes from Africa, 97% of them went somewhere other than what became known as the United States of America. Yet who in all the media gets the blame for slavery in the world? And was the United States even around then? No. British merchants, Dutch merchants, Portuguese slave traders, they're all involved. But listen to the words of United States Senator Tim Kaine of Virginia on the floor of the United States Senate on June 16, 2020.
And we need to do much more within the criminal justice system, but also within all of our systems, to dismantle the structures of racism that our federal, state, and local governments carefully erected and maintained over centuries. We know a little bit about this in Virginia. First African Americans into the English colonies came to Point Comfort, Virginia in 1619. They were slaves. They didn't be captured against their will. But they landed in colonies that didn't have slavery. There were no laws about slavery in the colonies at that time. The United States didn't inherit slavery from anybody. We created it.
We created it in 1619. Yeah. By the way, do you know what happened to the 20 to 30 slaves that were brought to Point Comfort, Virginia in 1619? They were put into indentured servitude. Then once the price was paid for their servitude, they'd worked it off, they became free, became their own landowners, and became masters for other indentured servants to come over. They usually leave that rest of the story off, though, don't they, when they tell it? In fact, though it was